Joining me now from Washington, D.C., former U.S. Marine and behavioral expert, Eric Rittmeyer. Eric, this is the choice that the United States, we as a country, our society has right now, right? We can have this knee-jerk reaction to these mass killings, and you can be a Chuck Schumer and call for the regulation of body armor, and you can attack President Trump and try and blame him for what transpired. You can run around the country calling for a, quote, assault weapons ban, or you can do what I'm doing, and that is doing some heavy soul searching and trying to figure out what are the common bonds, what are the common links here, why is our society producing lately some very young mass murderers?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to point out here that are critically important. Number one, there's no way to stop people from killing other people. It's going to happen. It will continue to happen no matter what you do, number one. Number two, there's no one person that's directly responsible for this. And number three, there's no one thing that's directly responsible. We're not just suffering from a gun violence epidemic, we're suffering from a hate epidemic in this country. There's tons of hatred, and when it comes to these mass shooters, you're right, there's a knee-jerk reaction for gun control when we avoid looking at the facts here. Dr. Warren Farrell wrote a great book called The Boy Crisis, which basically states 90% of mass shooters suffer from a dad deficit, which means they grew up in houses without fathers. That's the number one main factor for all these mass shooters. It's a lack of a father figure.
See, that's huge. That's a huge factor that no one's even talking about. You're the first person I've heard bring that up, but it makes total sense, and it kind of dovetails into what I will bring up in just a couple minutes here. But first, we do have a violent society to a certain degree, but heck, it was just as violent when I was a child growing up, and we didn't have young people running around committing mass murder. That said, we have a society that is sometimes violent, but it seems as though as a society we're accepting violence more and more. That plus the internet. The internet has created an entire generation that lives in a two-dimensional, not a three-dimensional, a two-dimensional fantasy world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely accurate. There was a study done by the University of California at Riverside that basically said by the time a child reaches the age of 18, they've witnessed over 200,000 acts of violence, 16,000 of which were murders via television, via social media. You can't in a right mind tell me that those witnessing those type things didn't desensitize their brains to murder, to crime. These are things, they do these studies and they say, okay, when was a video game released and how many crimes followed it? Well, there's no direct link to video games and violence because there's no crime that directly follows it. It's absolute insanity that people don't put the link together, that when you sit in front of a computer and you don't learn how to communicate with other people, you're more into social media than social interaction. That's going to translate into something bad when you couple it with a major mental illness.
Right, and so that goes to the other point I've been making ad nauseum on this program for many, many years now, and that is the parenting. You brought up the point of 90% of these killers don't have a male in the household to balance out, however he's being raised. And if you have a parent who's filling that gap with allowing this child to sit down in front of a video game, possibly a violent video game, for hours and hours and hours on end, that to me is tantamount to child abuse. But when we look at the profile of these killers, they have some common threads, don't they, besides this dad deficit, Eric? They're young males. They have psychological issues, clearly. And I would point out the killers aren't born. They're conditioned in a certain way. It could be video games. Hey, listen, most 99.9% of the people in the world play video games. They don't kill. But if the environment is right or wrong, depending on how you look at it, it could motivate some unstable person. And then the final factor I put in there is God, a lack of God. If you look at Sandy Hook killer, if you look at Parkfield, you look at Gilroy, El Paso, and Dayton, they all have these common denominators.
They do, and this sounds horrible to say, Graham, but I got to tell you, pointing out the dad deficit and the lack of father role models, you look at the cities like I'm from Baltimore. I mean, in Baltimore, 70% of families in Baltimore are without fathers.
Yep.
Okay, so when you take that number and look how many people are growing up without it, on top of, you talk about common denominators, a very vast majority of these mass shooters, they suffered some sort of early childhood trauma. It might have been violence from a parent. It could have been a suicidal parent. It could have been some sort of severe bullying. They've also studied these people who go out and commit these mass shootings. They study looking for validations from other people who have done it. And then they've also suffered some sort of trigger normally. Leading up to this, within the last 6 months or so, normally there was a trigger that caused it. All those things together, on top of having the means to do it, that's what creates a situation. But to say it's any one thing is crazy. And from a political standpoint, that's the reason why everything goes back to pointing to gun control, because it's easy from a political standpoint to say, do this or else you agree with mass murders, as opposed to, it's a father problem. How do we correct that? Who's to blame for that?
Want to see more videos like this? Click on the link below and subscribe to One America News on YouTube. And call your cable provider and kindly demand that One America News is added to your lineup. Call and subscribe today.